Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending the first topic webinar for the SSI Informative Research Project, Benefits Counseling as a Tool to Improve Employment Outcomes for Youth Who Receive SSI. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any questions for presenters during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your questions. We'll address as many questions as possible during the session, but if a more detailed answer is required or we run out of time, we will answer your question later. We do capture all questions. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. However, you can also submit technical questions via the Q&A widget. Please note, most technical issues can be resolved by pressing F5 or Command-R on Macs to refresh your player console. Finally, there are other widgets that are available at the bottom of your screen. For example, a copy of today's slide deck is listed in the Resource widget. It's a blue file icon at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd just like to introduce Kelly Cran. Kelly, you now have the floor.
Happy Wednesday, everybody. Thank you, Brian. Again, my name is Kelly Crane, and I'm from the University of Maryland. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to the first of 5 topical webinars hosted by Mathematica's Formative Research Project examining employment transition for youth who receive supplemental security income. This project, which is funded by the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor, seeks to build on the knowledge of SSI youth recipients and the factors that influence their transition to gainful employment. Today's webinar will discuss benefits counseling as a tool to improve employment outcomes for youth who receive SSI. This session will highlight the effect that benefits counseling has on employment outcomes, offer best practices in benefits counseling, and share lessons learned from large-scale studies on the provisions of benefits counseling. I'm really excited and honored to introduce today's speakers. We have Jeff Hemmecher. Jeff is an economist with the Office of Research Demonstration and Employment at the U.S. Social Security Administration. Jeff will provide an overview of the SSA rules and work incentives. Next, we'll hear from Thomas Golden. Thomas is the Executive Director at the Institute on Employment and Disability at Cornell University. And Thomas will take the conversation from policy to practice and share what we know works as it relates to benefits counseling. Thomas will be followed by Ellie Hartman. Ellie is with the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development and the University of Wisconsin-Stout. Ellie also serves as the project manager for Wisconsin Promise, and Ellie will share what they are learning from their Promise and other state initiatives. So let's go ahead and get started. I will turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon. And thanks to Department of Labor and everybody else at Mathematica and also for joining us and inviting me to speak here. So I'm going to present the basics of supplemental security income or SSI rules and work incentives. And I'm going to focus on transition-age youth, as one would expect for this presentation. I'm really only going to scratch the surfaces of these policies, and anybody seeking specific information about how they affect any one person's eligibility or payment amount should talk to somebody in an SSA field office or a benefits counselor, which is something that will come up throughout this presentation today. First, though, I want to make sure everybody knows what SSI is, in case people are attending who don't know. As I mentioned, it is supplemental security income. In 1972, legislation brought together several federal grants to states into a single federally administered program. The first payments began in 1974. SSI guarantees a minimum level of income for age, blind, or disabled individuals. It acts as a safety net for individuals who have limited resources and little or no Social Security or other income. Although it is a federal program, states have the option to supplement federal payments. And I'm not going to get into any state-specific payment supplement issues today. To give a sense of scope, there are over 8 million individuals who receive SSI payments, and last year it totaled more than $54 billion. To be eligible for SSI, an individual must meet certain requirements. They have to be age, blind, or disabled, be a citizen or a qualified alien, be a resident of the United States District of Columbia or the Northern Mariana Islands, and have income and resources not exceeding certain limits, and they need to file an application. I'm going to focus mainly today on the elements that have to do with the first and fourth requirements. But the other ones are definitely important and come up every once in a while. Okay, so to start, as I mentioned, SSI is part of the social safety net, and as such, it's means tested. An individual cannot have resources greater than $2,000, and a couple cannot have resources greater than $3,000. These limits have not changed in several years. And I should mention here that even though there are rules about couples, SSI is generally an individual and not a family benefit, so it gets paid to an individual. The maximum federal benefit an individual can receive is $750, and a couple can receive up to $1,125, and those are in 2018. And those amounts do change every year. The amount is reduced for any earned or unearned income according to various rules. The first $20 of any income does not count against the payment, the benefit amount. Benefits or payments are reduced by half of earnings above $65, and in general, unearned income reduces payment, SSI payments dollar for dollar. There are many, many other rules that go into this, and I'll get to some of them later, but that's kind of the basics of it. One thing that is very important is, especially for the population, SSI transition and youth population, is deeming. And by deeming, I mean that portion of a child's parents' income and resources that are considered available to the child. I'm not going to go over all the aspects of that, but it's a pretty complex calculation, but there are allowances for different types of income. There are allocations for ineligible children, and there's parental living allowance. So not all of a parent's income is deemed to a child, but a lot of it is. Sorry. Turning to the definition of disability for children and adults under age 65, SSI does have a very specific definition of disability for children. It's a medically determinable physical or mental impairment that results in marked and severe functional limitations and can be expected to result in death or has lasted or can be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. For adults, it's similar, but it's a medically determinable physical or mental impairment that results in the inability to do substantial gainful activity and can be expected to result in death or has lasted or can be expected to last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. To determine whether or not an individual has a disability that qualifies, there's a 3-step process for children and a 5-step process for adults. They're very similar to start with for both. They start with determining whether or not an individual has earnings above the substantial gainful activity level, which for the non-blind individual is $1,180 a month. If an individual earns above that, then they are technically not eligible and the application would stop. If they don't have earnings above that level, it goes on to step 2, which is whether or not they have a severe impairment. Step 3 for children is whether or not that impairment meets or equals the medical listings or functionally equals a level of severity of the listings. And that's a level that can actually lead to an allowance, that step. And for people who don't know what the listings are, there's basically a list of medical conditions that SSA considers severe enough to prevent substantial gainful activity in adults or causes marked and severe functional limitations for children. There are separate listings for children and adults, so there's quite a bit of overlap as well. For adults, there's the earnings test, the severe impairment step, and meets or equals medical listings as a 3rd step. But there's also a 4th and 5th step where SSA looks for the capacity to perform past relevant work. And if they can't do that, then there's the test of capacity for any work in the national economy. SSA periodically checks whether an individual continues to meet the medical criteria for SSI, and these periodic checks are called continuing disability reviews, or CDRs. A big difference between the initial determination of disability and a CDR is that a CDR uses the medical improvement review standard, where SSA is looking for a decrease in the medical severity of the impairments that existed at the last favorable determination that will enable an individual to engage in SGA. So it's not a whole cloth reevaluation of the impairment, but there are, of course, exceptions for things like failing to cooperate with the CDR or for fraud. I'm going to skip the first bullet here for about what the CDR process looks like for children, but I will say that at age 18, there's a similar review of eligibility. It's actually called a redetermination of eligibility. It's not a CDR. It is not subject to the MERS standard, the Medical Improvement Review Standard. It basically goes through the initial claim process with the exception of the first step. And so the first step is whether or not an individual engages in SGA. And so during an age 18 redetermination, SSA is not going to consider whether or not somebody is working above SGA, and there's not an immediate cessation of benefits if somebody is working. So the time I have left, I'm going to go over some of SSA's policies about work and resources. SSA fully acknowledges that the rules can be complex. There's one resource, it's called the Red Book. It's written in plain English, and it tries to help explain these rules. It greatly expands on everything in the next few slides. I also want to point out that SSA recently began sending a brochure to all recipients ages 14 to 17 with resources that could be helpful for transition. It also includes a brief bit of information about the age 18 redetermination, since research has suggested many youth and their families are not fully aware of it. And so there's some links on this slide that have resources where you can find those two publications. The next three slides cover some work incentives in the SSI program. The three on this slide are fairly automatic. 1619A is the part of the law that allows recipients to earn more than SGA. Essentially, it removes SGA as a criteria after the initial eligibility determination. And if you think about the way I described the process before, that there's this 1 for 2 $1 offset for every $2 that an individual earns above $65. That ramp can kind of go past the substantial gainful activity level, and so Section 1619A basically allows that, and as well. Section 1619B, it allows individuals to continue to receive Medicaid even if their earnings reduce the SSI payment to zero and they need Medicaid to work. There are different thresholds in each state. In 2017, this ranged from a low of $18,660 in the Northern Mariana Islands to a high of $66,308 in Connecticut. There are also individualized thresholds if medical expenses are very high. Currently, between 77,000 and 80,000 individuals take advantage of this provision. The student earned income exclusion allows individuals under age 22 and regularly attending school to exclude a substantial amount of earnings from SSI calculations. This is applied before the earned income exclusion or the general income exclusion. And there is a monthly cap of $1,820 and a yearly cap of $7,350. Some other SSA work incentives include the Plan to Achieve Self-Support, or the PASS program. This allows individuals to set aside certain income and resources for SSI purposes if those income and resources help the individual pursue a work goal that will reduce or eliminate SSI payments. It's important to know that this is a formal plan and it needs to be formally approved by SSA. SSA also doesn't count certain items or services needed, or the cost of certain items or services needed for work that are related to an individual's disability. There are general impairment-related work expenses and also blind work expenses. There's also a higher blind SGA level For initial eligibility, it's currently $1,970 a month compared with the $1,180 a month for non-blind applicants and recipients. And the blind and blind work expenses and impairment-related work expenses enter into the calculations in different locations and can be differently favorable. So I won't get into that calculation. Even more work incentives, what's called Section 301, or continued payment under VR or similar program provision. If an individual is found ineligible as a result of a medical CDR or an age 18 redetermination, and the individual can continue to receive benefits if they're participating in an appropriate program of vocational rehabilitation or similar services. And this is to allow them to continue to finish up that program so that they will eventually potentially not need SSI. In addition to VR, other programs that count towards Section 301 would be PASS plans and individualized education programs and a few others. This does require a specific application. And I should point out again, that's not something that happens at an initial claim. It's just for medical CDRs and age 18 redeterminations. And I did mention individualized education programs. That is only for the age 18 redetermination for the most part. The other work incentives on this page, I'm not going to say too much about. Expedited reinstatement is when somebody loses SSI eligibility because of work. They can actually start SSI up again pretty quickly within 5 years of the initial payment ending, as long as they continue to meet the other SSI eligibility criteria, including having that same or related medical impairment. Unsuccessful work attempts and subsidies or other special conditions are generally only at the initial claim level, and I'm not sure how common they are actually, so I'm really not going to say too much about that in the interest of time. Some other relevant SSA policies that are kind of useful for the transition age population would be advanced foster care filing. You can file for SSI 180 days before exiting foster care. And it's designed to help somebody who's making that transition hopefully get a determination before they leave foster care and be able to get the support that they need when they are independent. The Achieving a Better Life Experience accounts, or ABLE accounts, allows up to $100,000 of money deposited into that account to be excluded from the resource calculations, which, as I said before, for an individual would be $2,000. And also the contributions to, earnings of, and distributions from ABLE accounts don't count for income as income for SSI. There are similar exclusions for individual development accounts that are available through TANF or Assets for Independence Act grants. And there are a lot of other resource exclusions that I'm not really going to go into, but they include trusts, property, essential self-support, burial plots, and a number of other ones. SSA knows that these policies are complex and that they're all based on laws. SSA isn't making up these things just to be complex. In each SSA field office, there is a work incentive liaison, or WIL, who can provide information about work incentives. There are also area work incentive coordinators, or AWICs, who are responsible for work issues over a broader geographic area than the WILs. These are SSA employees whose job is to help provide information and support on work incentives and issues. SSA also funds external organizations called Work Incentive Planning and Assistance, or WIPA providers, who provide benefits, counseling, and outreach to beneficiaries. SSA also funds agencies under the Protection and Advocacy for Beneficiaries of Social Security, or PASS program, and they generally help protect the rights of persons with disabilities. SSA also runs a Ticket to Work program. Although many beneficiaries are likely eligible for vocational rehabilitation services, for which SSA will reimburse for successful outcomes. Beneficiaries can also seek services from non-VR providers called employment networks. SSA will reimburse employment networks for specific outcomes and milestones earnings outcomes and milestones that beneficiary receives. Although I will note that you have to be an adult in order to participate in the ticket program. Not necessarily we are, though. Finally, I do want to add that SSA does have a request for information out about supporting youth in transition. I strongly encourage everybody to look that up at the Federal Register. Responses are due February 2nd, and I hope you all are able to comment and provide some good answers to the questions that are asked there. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to the esteemed Thomas Golden, who will present more on benefits counseling. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. As you heard from Jeffrey, clearly there has been a very long congressional and legislative history pertaining to the policies that the Social Security Administration administers in an attempt to remove barriers to beneficiaries and recipients of supplemental security income and the Social Security Disability Insurance Program to be able to return to work. But as you can imagine, Jeff started out with the medical model description of the disability standard, which is very much a deficit-based standard, and many of the work incentives that you heard him talk about and that you heard him highlight really had to focus on ability and capacity, and how do we maximize that for individuals with disabilities who receive these types of public entitlements. And so it's not a surprise that as over the past 3, 4, 5 decades, we've added new policies to the return to work process for SSA beneficiaries, that path to work has become much more complex to navigate, much more challenging to navigate, and enter this emerging field of benefits and work incentive counseling. And so what I want to do is talk to you about some lessons learned over the past few decades as this field has continued to emerge, and the value of this field to supporting employment outcomes. And I couldn't help but, as I was looking through the attendance list and looking at the close to 550 people that are on here today, that many of you have played a really large role in doing important work that's contributed to what we have learned to date about how benefits and work incentives plan and assistance can really support effective outcomes. And so a disclaimer as I'm starting is to recognize that many of the demonstrations that I'm going to be highlighting, we recognize that there are some state variances in the data, and some of you might be sitting there and go, oh, Tom forgot to mention this, or he didn't mention that we did this in this particular state. We're really going to try to keep at the top of the trees here, and so there will be a bit of a dampening effect to maybe some specific state nuances that some of the demonstrations found, but we definitely have some lessons learned over the past 3 decades that we want to take some time today to talk about and to highlight. As you know, the SSI and DI roles continue to grow exponentially in the United States. And despite our best efforts, most recently with the passage of the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Improvement Act, we've yet to consistently decrease the trajectory of disparate employment outcomes for those people who receive these public entitlements. We also know that with the passage of the Workforce Investment and Opportunities Act, that we will be seeing increasing numbers of youth that are intersecting with our workforce development system and our vocational rehabilitation system. And interestingly enough, with that increased priority on youth that came about through the passage of this piece of legislation, we know that youth who receive SSI pose particular challenges to the return to work process. We know that research has shown that they rarely come off from the rolls. That in many cases they're not completing school, they're not participating in vocational rehabilitation, there's a higher likelihood of incarceration, and even less likely access to transition support services. You couple that with the composite picture of their families, and it shows families that have needs as well, that there is more than one member with a disability. There's low educational achievement, low financial literacy, multi-generational reliance on public benefits, and lack of information to increase their family self-sufficiency. And what it does is it presents a real challenge. When we talk about the return to work process, when we talk about financial empowerment and giving people a leg up out of poverty, because SSI, as Jeffrey talked about, is a means-tested program. It really does begin to dictate a specific set of interventions that might be necessary to support more positive outcomes. But before I get into some of those demonstrations, I want to set a foundation for us of what we mean by benefits and work incentive counseling. This was defined for us back in 2000 in the Journal of Voc Rehab as a set of benefits and strategies, services, and supports for work incentive counseling that seek to promote work preparation, attachment, and advancement, focusing on enhancing self-sufficiency and independence of individuals with disabilities who receive disability benefits and other public entitlements through informed choice, which may result in decreased reliance on public benefit programs and increased financial well-being. That's a loaded definition. There's lots of really powerful words in there, and as you look at that definition, one of the things I want to point out is there's a staging, right? It talks about work preparation, work attachment, work advancement. At each one of those phases in the employment decision-making process, there's a need for some sort of strategy, service, or support that might come from a dedicated benefits and work incentives counselor to support the individual through informed decision-making. And at any one of those junctures, that may result in decreased reliance, or in some cases, it may not if the person, because of the complexity of the work incentive programs, is not going to be financially well off enough to support their needs through the programs. And so that is our definition. There was a body of research that came out in the 2000s that really tried to focus on, so let's try to understand more. So what should benefits and work incentive counseling include? And some initial research that was done in 2008 identified really 7 parts of a taxonomy that pointed to a fidelity-based model of benefits and work incentive planning. It included outreach, which is identification and sourcing of who these individuals are in the community, information and referral, kind of addressing the basic needs of people and their families, and we're going to talk about that more. Data collection and profiling, developing an understanding of the actual portfolio of experiences and benefits a person might have. Benefits analysis, not just identifying those, but then understanding as a person returns to work, as they have earnings, what's going to happen to those benefits that an individual might have. Scenario advisement and counsel, so taking the analysis that was done to actually develop future-oriented scenarios that support goal development for that person as they think about employment and greater economic empowerment. Problem solving and advocacy, this realm is all focused around crisis management, services, and supports. Again, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then finally, coaching, and this is really thinking about proactive services that are leading toward operationalizing a plan. How do we actually go beyond a person just making a decision, but actually helping them put an action plan into place? John Louis did some additional follow-up work, and he kind of boiled that taxonomy of 7 areas down into 3 primary functions. That function of screening, that function of advisement, and then that ongoing management, right? So understanding benefits, counseling about those benefits, and then supporting people in taking action. And toward that end, since the early 90s, we have had a trail of inquiry and learning that has been taking place nationally for us here that have tried to look at how we support greater employment and economic outcomes for beneficiaries and recipients. And I'm going to just talk real briefly about these because I think it's important to look at the breadcrumb trail of where we've been, so that, one, we learn from that. We learn about what is it that we need to take forward and what is it that we need to continue to test and understand to really support the best outcomes that we can achieve and decrease the disparities that exist for this population. Project Network was in the early 90s, and it really focused on offering intensive outreach, work incentive waivers, and case management. And what that project really found was a small short-term effect on earnings, although no effect on benefits. What's important to recognize is that in this early 90s, benefits counseling as a field was emerging, and we may have had more of an increased emphasis at that point on benefits maximization. How do we help people begin to work, but work up to a point so that they don't lose the safety net that provides? Remember, that was kind of a pre-ticket to work environment for us in testing that model. But come around 1998, as we're approaching that ticket to work era, if you will, the state partnership initiatives launched, and they tested 18 state-designed interventions that were focused on improving employment outcomes. And what was interesting about those is that the focus really was on, again, trying to determine what could be the effect of providing certain types of interventions, services, and supports. And while we found through the study that there were some mixed effects on employment, again, there was really no effect or a negative effect in some cases on earnings. Now, that said, there were some variances in states where they found positive outcomes that we do want to emphasize, but again, it was more correlational and not cause and effect to the things that they were testing. As we operationalize Ticket, you heard Jeffrey talk about the work incentive outreach provision of the Ticket to Work Act. He talked about that external network of benefits counselors that are out there. And there was an interesting customer satisfaction survey done in 2004 that found that while the services that were provided were really important and that they trusted their counsel, they trusted what they said was true, there was this one really important takeaway that said while they reported knowing what to do and how their benefits were going to be impacted, they reported not knowing what to do next on their path to employment because benefits counseling stopped short of putting their hand in the hand of somebody that was going to help them develop the goals and operationalize the goals toward working. And that was a real critical takeaway, and we saw SSA shift from the BPAO model into the WIPA, Work Incentive Plan and Assistance model, which was much more focused on employment and really intentional collaboration and partnership between benefits counseling and connecting them into the Ticket to Work program. In 2000, you saw the youth transition demonstration. This was our first efforts to really take a look at how to maybe reverse this upward trajectory of youth on benefits and what effective practices might look like. What we did learn was that substantial doses of well-designed employment services were found to improve key employment outcomes in the short and mid-range, but follow-up studies, more longitudinal studies, actually did find that there were a positive effect on paid employment during the third year after the youth were actually enrolled in the evaluation. And those longitudinal studies, a nice part of that is that we can look over time. Even though there might not have been the impact in the short run, maybe in a longer period of time, we'll see that having a return. Another one that I want to mention is the SGA, or Substantial Gainful Activity Project. That was conducted in 2013 to 16 in Minnesota and Kentucky, and that was a VR-centric demonstration that looked at offering faster-paced services, rapid engagement with clients. And what's interesting is that there were some real positive takeaways from that. It appeared from the results that the individuals that received these coordinated set of services had increased engagement with VR, signed IEPs or individualized education program, and also some increases in outcomes that were actually achieved by the individual. And now we're kind of brought up to contemporary where we've got promise. New York State, I'm a participant in the New York State Promise. You're going to be hearing from Ellie in a little bit. Those are 5 states and 1 multi-state consortium that were funded by the Department of Ed, Labor, and Health and Human Services with support from the Social Security Administration to evaluate it, with a key goal of improving the provision and coordination of services to promote positive changes in the outcome of youth ages 14 to 16 who receive SSI. And Ellie's going to talk a little bit about some of those findings, and I'm going to talk a little bit anecdotally about what we have begun to learn. A big question that we're left with after we conclude these demonstrations and you sit back and you try to reflect a little bit, why aren't our outcomes better? You look at the outcomes that we've achieved as a result of these demonstrations that have been enacted, and what we begin to learn when you look a little closer is that sometimes the basic needs of students and families are often not met, and so that really has a dampening effect on their participation. Maslow's hierarchy does apply in these families. It's clear that our current policies are still very complex, and that there are some unintended consequences across different public entitlements and benefit programs. We also know from research that's been done that the on-ramp to full employment for people who receive SSI is slow at best. People take a gradual, go into the shallow end of the pool before they go out to the deep end, and that's important to keep in mind. Some would actually conjecture that the expectations of our employment service providers may be too low in working with this population, and that there may be third-party influencers that are culpable in maybe perpetuating underemployment and unemployment of the population as a whole. But what I want to conclude with before I turn it over to Ellie is talking a little bit about what are the major takeaways from us. Across these demonstrations, there definitely have been some lessons learned. The first is that the basic needs of youth and families do pose challenges to their readiness for services and supports. And so it's critical that basic problem-solving, advocacy, and crisis management are critical facets of the taxonomy of services that are going to be provided to SSI youth and their family. Also, that intensive case management is an essential to engaging families effectively over time. We also know that SSI and other means-tested programs do provide essential support towards mitigating the effects of poverty. And so it's important to recognize coming into this that in many of these households, that benefit check is a primary part of their monthly usable budget. And so with that and the priority of that comes the need to understand how do we create other earnings and income safety nets that might mitigate some of the challenges posed by that. We also know that financial literacy leads to financial empowerment, and that's a critical core part of effective services, is making sure that we're just not educating people about benefits and work incentives, but we're also focusing on building their financial literacy. We also know that secondary and post-secondary ed supports and completion of those programs definitely have a positive impact on work, and investing in those types of supports are critical to achieving better ends. Finally, just the last couple bullets here. We know that benefits and work incentives planning and assistance is an employment support service and cannot operate in a vacuum. There is not a cause and effect to benefits planning that we've yet to identify. We know that it has to work in tandem with high-fidelity, quality employment services, and that family engagement is important to its success. Also, the information regarding the impact of earnings has to be carefully and proactively staged over time in the way that families can understand it and students can understand it in the doses that they're ready for at the points in time when they need it most. Also need to recognize the multifaceted nature of decision-making, that there are 5 really critical stages to decision-making about employment, and at each of those stages, as you see here in the slide, there needs to be a specific set of services and triage of services that are going to be available. Finally, team coordination is essential. We learned from the SGA demonstration that team coordination is a really critical element, and that there's power in dedicated personnel that are working with the population. And so, Ellie, why don't you take the floor now and talk to us a little bit more about some of the most contemporary things that you've been learning through the Wisconsin Promise Project.
Thank you, Thomas and Jeff. That was great. So we've got some preliminary data to look at, and I wanted to be able to share that with everyone as the population in Promise is youth receiving SSI. So in Wisconsin, and I know as well as in other states, as you saw with Thomas's presentation, we really built on the experiences that we have within the state. So we've had several research projects with individuals in receiving Social Security benefits. And when I started working in this area, we were in the middle of the Wisconsin Benefit Offset Pilot. And they just had done the state partnership project prior to that. And in both of those projects, we saw the biggest predictor, correlator of employment outcomes was actually benefits counseling. Now, it's a correlation, so there's not a cause and effect here, but we do see that benefits counseling, more and above all the other things we looked at in these projects, was better predicted employment outcomes. Now, of course, if someone's working, work incentive benefits counseling, it's important to talk about those different work incentives and how work impacts benefits and things like that. But I also think that benefits counselors really help talk to individuals receiving Social Security benefits about their fears, what possibilities are there that they might not have known about, and then also when they do start working, making sure that the work incentives they're eligible for, they have the right paperwork in, they're reporting their earnings correctly, and then that they're being applied correctly. So one of the biggest things that could happen is either being under or overpaid with your disability check, and if that happens and they attribute that to work and they don't have someone to talk about that or help them through that, they might think work isn't worth it. So benefits specialists in these projects across the states, this is why there are, WIPAs, as Jeff was talking about, has really been a good companion to helping individuals with disabilities who are receiving Social Security benefits to work. So really just building on to that experience and other experiences in Wisconsin really helped us lead to how we were going to develop benefits counseling for Promise specifically. And then the other piece I wanted to mention, and I know I'll probably re-mention it later, and it's a really important piece. Yes, work incentive benefits counseling is important, but so is those local Social Security folks and the area work incentive coordinator, the AWIC, both of those pieces. So a benefits specialist can help folks understand, help talk to that Social Security office, but the better the local Social Security office understands those work incentives, the more collaborative the area work incentive coordinator is, the more understanding on those work incentives, the more they know about the possibility of work for individuals receiving benefits, the better that service is and the better outcomes there are. And so in Wisconsin, we're very lucky to have a wonderful AWIC, and we did previously too. So we've been in a very good position there. And our local folks, we see a variance throughout the state, but definitely for the most part have good collaboration, and that's super important. So I also wanted to mention that piece as well. So after the benefit offset program got involved with Wisconsin's Let's Get to Work grant, this was a AIDD grant, Administration for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities grant, specifically looking at increasing employment outcomes for youth with intellectual or developmental disabilities. And there was a whole there's a whole piece and lots of things we learned on that, but the one piece I want to focus on here is we wanted to connect youth with benefits counseling, and we did know that a lot of our benefits counseling was happening with adults, not necessarily with youth. And as youth were getting services really originally designed for adults, what we were finding is youth were getting a full benefits analysis and given a lot of scenarios of what could happen if this happened or that happened. And in some cases, not always, what families were finding was they were like, oh my gosh, I have to remember all this stuff. This seems super complicated. Is it really worth it? And it was almost, it wasn't helping as much as we've seen in the past. And so based on that information, we really thought for Promise, what we need to do is a more consultative approach. Yes, have a benefit analysis available if that makes sense for the youth or a family member, but instead what we're going to do is look at a benefits consult. So meet the families where they're at. What do they want to talk about? Is a youth ready to try a work experience? What does that mean? Maybe all we need to talk about is student earned income exclusion. Some families aren't ready to talk about Social Security benefits, but as they talk to their benefits specialist, in Wisconsin, our training is not only on the Social Security, but also our local benefits, so food share, housing, health care definitely. And so we had one grandma who was like, no, I don't want to talk to anyone. No, I don't. And at the beginning of the meeting, they talked about the youth SSI. And she was still like, why am I here? I don't want to talk to you about this. And then our benefits specialist brought up food share, and the grandma was like, wait a minute, what? You can answer my food share questions? I have a lot of questions for you. And so there they were able to answer the questions about food share, which then now, hey, you have good information for me. Let's now talk about those Social Security benefits and the whole picture. So really important, meeting the families where they're at, where they're ready to have that conversation. And like I said, student earned income exclusion, maybe talks about impairment-related work expenses. A big thing with our Promise families is deeming as our family members start working or child care payments fluctuate from month to month. So deeming and reporting work activity and the income coming in, including those child care payments, is really important. We've had a lot of medical reviews and age 18 redeterminations. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but Section 301, continuing those benefits if they're found not eligible for under the adult rules, but are working towards that employment outcome, continuing to receive the youth benefit until they reach that goal. So those have been big pieces and milestones for Promise Youth, where it's important to talk to a benefits specialist. And like I said, the local pieces, Medicaid, food share, housing. And then as people are working, building on their assets, talking about the possibility of ABLE counts, those different pieces. So again, meeting families where they're at, not throwing all this at them at once, but seeing where the family is at and working with them where they're at, where they want to go. If they want more information, yeah, give it to them, but don't try to overwhelm them and try to provide all of it at once. I just wanted to let everyone know our Wisconsin Promise resources, because we have this approach, we have some short fact sheets on those different areas. Feel free to use them. This is a snapshot of our website. Our website is promisewi.com. It's in our benefits resource. There's the direct link. But just so you know, there's one-pagers designed for youth and families on student earned income exclusion, IRWIs, continued Medicaid coverage, deeming, Section 301, and then reporting work activity. If you're in Wisconsin, you'd also appreciate the Badger Care Plus. If you're not, you can ignore that one. So just wanted to let everyone know we have resources. Feel free to use them. So what did we find? We found, just like in our other projects, that those who've connected with a benefits specialist were more likely to be working. So we have, I'm jumping ahead, but so you see most of the youth who did connect with a benefits specialist have had a benefits consult. Consults are averaging just under 5 hours plus an hour plus for travel. We do have some who have a full benefits analysis, and the time for those is pretty similar actually to our consults. And then of those youth using work incentives, mostly student earned income exclusion, and then looking at Section 301, 58 have applied, 23 are currently using that work incentive. I'm going to skip over the family information, but family members also have access beyond the youth to a benefits specialist as needed, and this is more for family members with their own Social Security benefits. And then, as I said, the benefits counseling is definitely related to our employment outcomes. So the 455 youth who've met with a benefits specialist, twice as many had jobs, so 314 were working at 564 different jobs compared to the 577 youth who have not yet met with a benefits specialist, at least not yet. 176 have worked 280 different jobs. And we'd also see a slight difference between hours worked and wages earned. Specifically looking at the 34 youth now earning more than that substantial gainful activity amount, 22 or two-thirds of them have met at least once with a benefits specialist. So we're definitely seeing differences there. And then as Thomas mentioned, it's not only the benefits counseling, but adding that financial literacy coaching piece to that benefits counseling is very important. It's been with a lot of families living in poverty, setting monthly benefit budgets, savings, having a spending plan, paying off debt, negotiating a payment plan to do so, banking versus using those payday loans. So talking about the importance of building a banking and building credit and assets and investing. And in Wisconsin, we're connecting our youth and families to individual development accounts to better increase their assets. And so we have over 100 youth and almost 100 family members who are accessing those in Promise. So I just wanted to end with a quote from one of our benefits specialists here in Wisconsin. What better way to talk about where benefits counseling should go, but from those who are actually providing the service. And she said, "Here's my dream model for benefits counseling. Brief overview benefits counseling before someone works with regular check-ins as the person prepares for work, during work, to make sure that the reporting requirements are managed, and then as needed after work is established with less frequent check-ins. The initial regular check-ins would be to reassure the person that the information is true. That is definitely where people start to doubt that they can work and have enough money." And that's where I wanted to end. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ellie. What a great way to end this webinar. We will go to questions in a moment. I would like to thank Jeff, Thomas, and Ellie. That was a lot of information in 50 minutes, a lot of great information. I would also like to acknowledge and thank our partners at the Office on Disability Employment Policy, Kirk Liu, and his colleagues there. I'd like to turn it over now to Todd Honeycutt. Todd is the project director, and take a little bit of time to answer some of the questions you all have been posting. Todd?
Thanks, Kelly. So, Kelly said, I'm Todd Honeycutt. I'm a senior researcher at Mathematica. And I've been monitoring the questions. There are a lot more questions than we have time for in the few minutes that we have remaining. So I wanted to hit on a couple of them. And one is kind of cross-cutting, that across these different projects, different programs, what efforts are being taken to educate representative payees? And I throw that out to anyone on the panel. Maybe, Jeff, you could start.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I was looking at some other questions online.
Sure. Across these different projects regarding benefits counseling and educating consumers, what efforts have been undertaken to educate representative payees?
That's a good question. I'm actually not sure. If you would, I would point the questioner to the Social Security Advisory Board just released a report on representative payees, and there's a lot of good information there, but unfortunately I don't have any kind of things to say about it here. Sorry.
Todd, this is Thomas. I think, interesting looking at the history of demonstrations that have been done now. I didn't talk about bond or some of the other real interesting demonstrations that SSA has been involved in that might intersect more with the rep payee group. But as we look at the benefits counseling ones, I can't think, reading back through some of the research that I looked at preparing for this, of any of them that specifically mentioned outreach and or education with rep payees and the demonstrations themselves. But that doesn't mean that it might not have occurred, in some of the state demonstrations that were done, but I have real limited knowledge on anything that's occurred broad scale around that topic.
Ellie, this is a question for you in the Wisconsin Promise model. What's the difference between a consult and a BSA?
A consult and a benefits analysis. A consult would be more meeting the family where they're at and answering questions as they come up, and really answering the questions in the moment, but then being available to continue to have answer questions over a period of time, versus a benefits analysis where, at least in Wisconsin, they might be set up slightly different in other areas, where there's a specific intake of information and providing a report that provides information to an individual of what work might have impact on benefits and things like that. So it's more of a report and an single point analysis with a lot of the information, versus a back and forth over a period of time and meeting the family where they're at. I hope that answers the question.
And the final question, and this is for you, Jeff, and it's a question about the Section 301. And where can a youth apply, be covered under the Section 301 work incentive? And I think that it could be useful, but a lot of these questions have been specific to individuals or specific to situations, and there may be a place that you can recommend that individuals start in terms of how they get answers to these types of questions.
Well, I mean, I would definitely say look at the Red Book. I would go to the WIPA, the local WIPA, who should be available. The WILS and the AWICs that I mentioned are all great resources that I strongly encourage. For Section 301, I mean, I will say somebody has to already be participating in the program, like vocational rehabilitation, have an IEP, or have a PASS plan before an individual is determined not to be eligible for SSI during the medical CDR. But so as part of the process of the CDR, the age 18 redetermination, the recipient should proactively identify their participation and the Section 301 potential. There is a form, it's SSA 4290. It's development of participation in a vocational rehabilitation or similar program form, and there's a couple sections there that can be submitted. So that would, I mean, the interview for the CDR, the age 18 redetermination, is really where it should come up, and that's where it'll be flagged to get through the process. But I would definitely say it's good to be proactive about it and assertive on it.
And this is Ellie. This is Ellie. That's also one of our, we have a 2-pager front back on Section 301 that provides basically what Jeff just said, and some additional information of the specific forms and things like that. So if folks want a 1-pager kind of explaining that process, feel free to access that resource.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks to you, Thomas. So with that, we'd like to end the webinar. We appreciate everybody's participation. We do have a short survey that we would like you to fill out. And if I could turn it over now to Brian to close us out.
Thank you. This concludes the first topic webinar for the SSI Formative Research Group. To submit your 211 reflection to the presentation team, use the survey widget. The survey widget will appear on the browser window at the end of your event. You can also click on the survey widget in the console, enter your responses, and press submit. If you're unable to submit your responses at this time, go back to the on-demand recording and the survey widget will be there as well. The on-demand recording will be available approximately 1 day after the webcast using the same audience link that you were sent earlier. If you have any questions, to reach out to the project team by email the SSI-youth@mathematica-npr.com. Thank you. Have a great afternoon. This concludes today's webcast.